webinar. People will be coming in right now.
All right, looks like we have a few people starting to join us.
Oh, that's great. Welcome. Welcome everyone that's entering the virtual MP Brunch Connections session. We're going to take a few minutes until the majority of our participants are here before we start. And I see we're still a couple of minutes early. So I hope you have a nice brunch laid out before you so you can enjoy this session with a hot cup of tea or coffee and something tasty to eat. Of course, I'm not going to be doing that because I'm not going to be chewing a brunch in front of you on the screen.
Yeah, I think I'll try and avoid that too.
Budget. So last week was certainly a busy week in terms of consultations. We ran, what was it, 3 separate pre-budget consultations. So for anyone that participated in that, really appreciate it. And we got a lot of good feedback, which we've submitted to our finance minister. So we'll be starting in just a couple of minutes. I'm going to give the rest of the participants a couple of minutes before I formally start.
It's a beautiful sunny day out today.
Yeah. Well, to everyone who's joining us, thanks for choosing to be on the session. It is a beautiful sunny day, and a walk along the beach or the greenway, the Arbutus Greenway. I know you have alternatives for your time that are also equally rewarding, but I know that this session, when I chatted with Dirk about it a few weeks ago, his goal is to actually change how people see forests. And I think that that's something that many people in our community will be interested in.
All right, it's a minute past 11, so I can see we have quite a few attendees, so I'm gonna get started. Welcome everybody on this beautiful Friday to our February installment of our now virtual MP Brunch Connections. So today we have a very special guest, Dirk Brinkman, who will be speaking on the topic of reversing Canada's tragic forest management trends. After his presentation, there will be a question and answer period. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A button that's on the bottom of your webinar screen. We won't be monitoring the chat, so just please avoid using the chat for questions. And yeah, without further ado, I'll pass it on to the Minister of Digital Government, the Acting President of the Treasury Board, and your MP for Vancouver Quadra, Joyce Murray.
Well, thanks so much, Dinez. And again, thanks everyone who's joining us today. And I'll start by acknowledging that we're here on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish nations, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. So I typically start by giving you a bit of a snapshot of what's going on in Ottawa. Well, of course, these days it's going on virtually because we're pretty much all of the members of Parliament are working from our homes. It was a bit different last fall. I was in Ottawa about 6 weeks out of the fall, present in Ottawa for my work. That's not happening now. We are pretty much all working from home, other than a handful of MPs that are located right near the Parliament buildings in Ottawa. But one exciting, for me, a bit of inside baseball, but exciting development is that we will be using an app to vote starting next week. And for anyone who watches parliamentary proceedings, you will know that we have been voting virtually on Zoom, and that it takes about 50 minutes for one vote. So it can be pretty onerous from a time perspective. We had 5 votes on, I think it was on Wednesday, and it means you have to be on camera for the entire time. So 5 votes times 50 minutes with one 10-minute break in the middle. So we won't have that anymore. We'll be able to be far more effective with our time and still get the work of Parliament done. So that's one thing that is my report in from Ottawa. I mean, a couple of other things is I was really pleased to see Bill C-21, which has to do with gun control and just reducing the danger of violence on the streets from proliferation of guns, as well as providing cities with the powers to ban handguns in their city if that's what they choose to do and if that's what their citizens want. Not sure which way BC is going on that, or Vancouver, but I know Toronto and Montreal are both very, have been outspoken on their need to control handguns in their cities. We had a parliamentary vote that I wanted to touch into just because it attracted a lot of attention actually in the media and in the public sphere, and that was the parliamentary vote to declare genocide in terms of the Chinese government's treatment of the Uyghur population. As you probably are aware, cabinet ministers like myself abstained, and there was a reason for that, and that is that Canada, as a relatively small democracy, works with our multilateral partners through a variety of multilateral organizations, and it is a far more effective way for us to have our voice heard. And so should the ministers have voted, that would have meant an official government stand on the matter of genocide, whereas we think it is going to be more effective to work with other like-minded countries and determine as a bloc, as a group, how to proceed to address the concerns that we, of course, have around the treatment of Uyghurs in China. So that was the rationale there. I'm sorry that this is the kind of meeting where we can't have a back and forth on that, but I just am doing some reporting as to what's going on in Ottawa here. And lastly, I would say great news. 2 hours ago, we have yet another vaccination potential, and that's that the AstraZeneca vaccine was approved by Health Canada, and so that will add yet more doses to the provinces and territories, who are of course the entities that deliver the vaccination programs. So now my hope is that the provinces have taken this lull where we had a reduced supply for a month and used that to get very effective in terms of their the publics with the massive numbers that are now coming. We will have 6 million vaccines just of the first 2 that we had approved by the end of March, and so we're going to be on track to vaccinating everybody in Canada by the end of September or before. So good news for all of us, and especially those of us who have vulnerable family members and people like myself, who has a mom in a care home. So I think with that quick snapshot, I'm just going to get right into the material of our event today, which is a talk on reversing Canada's tragic forest management trends. And our special guest is, of course, my husband, Dirk Brinkman, who spent many decades in the forests of British Columbia, Alberta, and Ontario primarily, and has really developed a very interesting perspective on forests through work with indigenous communities that he's been doing really since the probably the 1980s, when I was still part of the company, and 90s. And so that indigenous perspective helps inform his holistic and very informed view of forests, forest management, the future of forests, and forest policy. So with that introduction, over to Dirk.
I'll share my screen. Thanks, Joyce. I'll just see how I share screens for a moment. You can see the PowerPoint, I believe.
Yep.
I'm also speaking from the Indigenous territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations on the unceded Salish Sea. And these are unceded territories. And I acknowledged my mother. Have I got the screen? Yes, switch the screens. Very good. Just give me a moment while I. And then put that on full screen. Thank you. The Luddite tries to do a virtual talk. In December, pardon me, I buried my mother where my father was with my family on the Mississauga Ojibwe lands in Newcastle, Ontario, and where I'd spent 14, 15 years of my childhood, and 14 years. And but I'm an immigrant there from the Netherlands, and there is a important deep resonance with a good view. One moment.
It's still wrong.
What's that?
It's still wrong. So it's.
Is it showing this?
Yes.
I see. So
Oh,
this.
Good to go. Now you're good. Sorry.
Now good to go. Thank you, Sabrina. Real Luddite. So the Indigenous acknowledgement that precedes everyone's talks is very important in understanding our future. The history of civilization is all about usually big men and who want their story told. It's propaganda. The history of balanced ecological and equanimity in the Indigenous histories, when people were thriving, the so-called Dark Ages, for example, the periods of history when this was not recorded, are often regarded as savage ages. But we are acknowledging the Indigenous peoples because they welcomed us as guests and as immigrants. I began to experience that when I first got into the forest. They welcome us as guests. It's fundamental to Indigenous culture to recognize we're all guests here. We're all dependent totally, utterly on the living biosphere, on our land, our water and air. And we're only here for a time. And we have all of this bounty. We have a responsibility to think of our children and grandchildren. And we know the trends in the globe today are imperiling all of that. Scale of this article appeared a month ago, and in the Conservation Science Journal, pardon me.
Before you move forward, it's still
Okay.
wrong. Would you like me to have a look?
It's still wrong. Oh, it's still
Yeah.
showing the shared screen.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Go ahead. Does anyone mind seeing my shared screen? But anyway,
pause share. Stop share. Sorry about this, everyone.
Well, no, thank you. It's a great effort dealing with it.
All right, we're gonna go through this guy. Here. Okay, let's see. I believe that should be good to go.
Um,
Yeah, you should be good to go. Okay, I'm so sorry about that. Okay, yes, we're set. Sorry.
So I need to move back to my previous slide. I'll do that here, I suppose. Is that going to work? Yeah. Last month, an article appeared, which was a collection of experts, one of whom I'd been in touch with for over 50 years, Paul Ehrlich, and who just shared in a typical conservative, peer-reviewed science journal, conservation science, that these trends, which are all interlocked and intertwining and are all negative, are more complex and than any expert can wrap their minds around. And we have a really difficult future, and it's not simply doom prophecy here, because this has happened. We've had the fires. All of you will remember 2017 and 2018, and I've got the image here of 2017 with the Elephant Hill fire, and which is that little horseshoe in where we have a project I'll talk about in a moment. But a ghastly future, a good example is the Camp Fire, where we had 18,000 buildings and it burned in California, and 85 people died. And this is a state with an incredibly robust fire response capacity, but that kind of event is totally out of control. The question is there a path forward? And Joyce and I were in Bali in 2007 at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was opened by what we felt then was a thrilling statement that what the world needs is less emissions and more sinks. Joyce had been the Minister of Water, Land, and Air Protection and put in play a promise at the election, 2005 election, that the next government would deliver climate policy, but she wasn't reelected and was getting involved in the national stage. And we were there where I've been involved in the climate negotiations, 9 or 10 of the negotiations, but we were there witnessing the strong balance that there is between nature-based climate projects and emissions. When carbon goes into the atmosphere, it's considered to be there for over 100 years. It will be there for more than 100 years. In the negotiations back at Kyoto, it was agreed that projects that go into the biosphere that are absorbed carbon on the landscape would be commitments of 100 years. When you decide that you're going to protect a forest or manage a forest, you have to think forward 7 generations. You have to commit to a long timeline. You have to consider the biotic dynamics as you reach forward through time, and you're reaching into the Indigenous rights and title. In Crown land in Canada, you're reaching into unresolved questions. So there's a simple problem that while climate projects offer a path forward, there's a problem of how do you engage and have Indigenous communities lead. And We started a project in 2010. By 2009, British Columbia had their first forced carbon offset protocol, and it was the first in Canada, a forced carbon offset protocol that was fairly rigorous. We've spent 4 years. Robert Seaton, who works with me, has spent 4 years rewriting it, so it'd be more internationally compliant. And we're all waiting for the National Carbon Bureau to table a national standard. But back in 2010, we looked at where is there a place where this can start? And so we approached the Cheakamus Community Forest, and working with EcoTrust, we developed what is called a improved forest management protocol. And in climate action, you can conserve areas, you can afforest areas that are completely cleared, or the more complex one with all of those options embed is the improved forest management module. And we applied that to Cheakamus. And Cheakamus is the community forest that involves the Lil'wat Nation, the Squamish Nation, and the resort municipality of Whistler. So we have an example here on 30 some thousand hectares of co-management, of an integrated approach, and one where these questions, making commitments 100 years forward, are intrinsically resolved. And undertaking a climate project without creating that resolution between Indigenous and traditional management, and traditional and maybe colonial management, the Crown land approach, you do that at your peril. It's one of the fundamentals of a project, but that actually creates another element of sustainability. I'm going to give you a quick sketch. What did we do in the FCOP project? This project, the Cheakamus project, we, for instance, recognized, first of all, we increased the rotation length on some of the stands. And the gray is the baseline, business as usual. The green is your project with some changes creates credits. So that, for example, creates some short-term credits. We also shifted harvest from old growth to second growth in the same forest area. The old growth will have as much as 850 tons of carbon on a hectare. The second growth has more typically in that area 350 to 450 tons per hectare. And but we can get some similar value out of those stands. So simply shifting harvest increases the carbon in the project. We also generally reduced the level of harvest by nearly half. And that's the biggest gain. And the money from these credits are allowing the forest to, and back at the original image, those two images of the Cheakamus forest were across the valley from the ski hill, and you can see clear cuts to the southeast. You saw more intact forest more directly north where harvesting's moved. And so the carbon credits funds the more selective logging, more smaller cuts, very tiny cuts actually, and it funds the communities, Squamish and Lil'wat communities members who have become the forest contractors to do all of this work as well as guardian work in the region. And it has created employment for those communities. It's maintained biodiversity and greater wildlife habitat. And it's even conserved, when you conserve the old growth, you are conserving trees for much higher value in the future markets. And so this project meets the goals that Whistler has of a close forests for its tourist skiers, and it meets the First Nation goals. And unfortunately, it's still, to my knowledge, the only project on Crown land that's using an improved forest management protocol. Not certainly the only project on Crown land, the Great Bear Rainforest, which Joyce, when she was Minister of Water, Land and Air Protection, reducing harvest levels, that's the Great Bear Rainforest, reduced it in the tens of millions of cubic meters and created led by the coastal communities, created a coast opportunity fund to animate those economies. In 2009, also the Future Forest Science Council was offering funding for some projects we were working with, we still do, with the Lachulams, who have tree farm license number 1 in the Upper Skeena. And so we conceptualized the project to start looking at more of the intrinsic complexity that is involved in aligning civic and Aboriginal communities' values. So we developed a, Ralph Matthews of UDC, we co-developed a methodology to identify the core values. We modeled the climate change in the region. We went to the communities with these future models and said, what are all of your issues? What are the main issues? We looked at what is core for those communities. And we developed a program that looked at what is core. What's core, these communities are all water centric. Some communities balance timber and water values, the more civic communities. The Aboriginal communities have water as the number one, but these communities are water or fish value centric, civic and Aboriginal. And we built the future ecosystem models using a European global vegetation modeling system with the University of Lausanne. But we also looked at Skeena water conservation model, looking at cumulative impact assessment. There's a core problem with cumulative impact assessment, which is the concern of all of these converging trends, and that is the rate of policy and practice change is incremental, but the cumulative impacts are rushing ahead. And what's required is a integrated landscape planning model. And so we began, how would we look at integrated landscape planning to avoid the cumulative impact assessment? So we basically said we need to reverse the cumulative impact assessment classic model Cortex developed and think about it from a landscape planning perspective, because it's complex business to do these projects and to do them right, and that's in our future. But this model gave us a good working exercise of how to combine getting to where Cheakamus was through a sociometric process and through planning process. In 2015-16, we were working with the Skichison community in the middle of the province, just west of Kamloops. And we're working on doing that kind of integrated landscape plan for the region and try and get the community, the Skichison community and the Thompson district to work more closely together in the Upper Deadman watershed, only about a 40,000 hectare area. And in 2017, the Crown was not ready to think about how would they do that. And so they said, well, do a bunch of riparian restoration. And so we developed a plan for some riparian restoration, the bottom, the streams that were exposed. But the Elephant Hill fire came in and burned the entire area in 2017. And it burnt areas of 11 of the Secwepemc communities. Kitchison is one of the Secwepemc nations. The Secwepemc nation is that larger area in the upper green. And the fire hazard, we were modeling fire hazard before we had actual fires to show the congruence. And so the 11 community leaders got together and formed the Elephant Hill Joint Leadership Council. And with the Forest Lands, Natural Resources, and Rural Development, the Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development, that large dirt ministry that deals with everything. The Thompson District Office, Rachel Pollard, and the leaders of the Secwepemc 11 communities that were impacted formed a joint leadership council. This was and we proposed this partially because the morel harvesting is the second crisis for Indigenous communities. The cash economy, people are off there. We have found some paid with cash and drugs. And it's always the case, these communities suffer an increased level of drug use when the pickers come around. And but what was accomplished? There was a guardianship program or the Secwepemc stewardship program, and 5 minutes, and I'm halfway good. And they accomplished public safety, environmental protection, but more importantly, they were honoring the sacred Secwepemc laws of caring, for their land. And they were also, trained by conservation officers, RCMP. We developed a large training program. They were able to deal with all of these issues that came up. People lost, vehicle accidents, wildlife incidents, kept people out of archaeological and environmental sites. It was an example of the UNDRIP UN declaration of respect for the, no, I'm not, the UN declaration, I'm not remembering the exact acronym here, but that the British Columbia government adopted this last fall, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And this was an example for that kind of stewardship. Another problem we have on these fires is that Indigenous people want to see climate change respected, and adaptation is a big dimension here. And so I was going to talk a bit about climate adjusted seed zones and the challenges that we have in getting industry to shift. But the problem is always getting industry to shift and working together on these integrated land use plans, right? In short, Rachel Pollard was the district manager, was seconded to Victoria for a year, and the government has just come out with an integrated landscape plan policy concept to impose eventually on the landscape, and to invite entrepreneurs to create the kinds of projects that we were butting our heads trying to develop. And so all of the modalities that are intrinsic to long time climate projects that are adaptive and that integrate traditional ecological knowledge with our ecosystem-based science have an opportunity to break out of this situation that I opened with. And I'm closing with a couple of high-level comments. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which commenced in 2000, and I was one of the people asked to describe our problems back then. And it was a 5-volume roll-up of the degradation of global ecosystems, the possible solutions. They recommend technical gardening, which is really manage your ecosystem, nurture it like a garden, but market to the globe. And so it modeled a little bit of where we might go. And this challenge of the relationship between ecosystem services and human well-being, humankind well-being has often been referenced as a way to think about our sustainability, our humankind's survival ability, and to relate to the environment. It is not deep enough, and another model that came out in 2009 that I was very impressed with from the Stockholm Resilience Center looked at the planetary boundaries that are all now far beyond threatened in a few cases, and 7 of which involve forests. And many people have tried to combine these models. In combining them, the first thing the Oxfam proposed, how do we create a just, safe space for humanity? As a donut, so they put the planetary boundaries to the outside and the tight relationship between our ecosystem health and human health inside. I've just merged them because our relationships with our forests, especially in British Columbia, but in every country that I've had the privilege of doing a bit of work in, is a road forward. And the integrated landscape plan is possible. The climate projects are now possible. The price for carbon is now going where we can do this far more creatively. Even the relationship between banks, interest rates, and natural systems growth and change, which has always been so separate, is now we can think about this natural living infrastructure that is our main sources in our economy from a completely different perspective. And so there's a new opportunity, and I've gone too long, so let's go to a few questions.
All right, thank you, Dirk, for that very interesting presentation. I'd just like to take a few moments to remind everyone, if you have a question you'd like to ask, please use the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen. Our team will be going through all of those. So the first question comes from Michael. The BC government is still permitting logging of old growth forests. How do we stop this? And a related question from John. Would banning logging of old growth forest be as devastating as devastating to industry as they would have us believe?
There are actually 2 questions. So I have a comment about the concept of old growth forest. I see that as part of our colonial language. And the interesting thing with old growth, which is what we call it, is that it's essentially forests that are pre-contact or late in the early contact. And they are essentially forests that were a product of Indigenous stewardship. And the Indigenous people are fire ecologists. They manage with fire in part, they manage with other tools. And the forests are complex, multi-age. The old growth forests, we call them old growth. But the condition of the forest pre-contact did not include huge wildfires like Elephant Hill and like we've been seeing in the whole Pacific Northwest in the US and in Canada here. It had small fires and occasional fires. And so it's essential to learn from these forests, and we have to protect them. Gary Merkel and Al Gorley, both of whom I have worked with in the past, and Gary's tall tan and Indigenous, and they're calling for a ban on all old growth logging, and that's not likely to occur entirely, but I believe that will happen gradually. And then the second question, why is that possible? Yes, industry is alarmed about it. It's a very weird moment in time. I'm giving this talk yesterday or 2 days ago. A board foot measure is how you value timber. 2 days ago, 1,000 board feet is worth more than $1,000. Our industry used to have headlines when the price got over $400, and we've never seen a price over $800. I mean, we're in the ozone here. The companies are finally making quite a bit of money. So the question is, can they afford to make a shift? A future that I project would have us log selectively to change the forest condition, would have us use fire again, indigenous-led fire practices, and would create maybe not the same profile of timber use, but technologies here. The strongest material on this planet is forest fiber, is wood fiber, and put up against spider silk and platinum steel, and tested at a micro strength level, wood fiber stands out. That's how we have all these incredible rectilinear three-dimensional space in which we all evolved, and of forests. And the industry now has mass timber conversion technologies available, just emerging in some areas, but certainly it's time for our industry to reinvest and rethink their conversion to be able to utilize the kind of wood that'll come out of changing our forests to become resilient, and as resilient as in pre-contact era.
Well, thank you for that response. It's very interesting. So the next question we have comes from John. He says, you presented some very interesting case studies. Could these be scaled up to the provincial level and possibly to a Canadian or North American level?
Yes, and yes, and intrinsically no. Yes, with some, the federal government now is launching nature-based climate program and saying we will fund, which means essentially co-fund, because the provinces are responsible for the forests, for natural resource management. The province of British Columbia has just introduced this new policy. They're still working out how they're going to implement, but the policy concept is designed to bring onto the landscape through a co-management process a long-term future, and do that kind of entrepreneuring that these case studies suggest could be integrated. And but no, to the degree that every project needs to be community-based, it needs to be local. What the territorial defines that would contain it could be a drainage, could be a traditional territory, it could be a logical, it could be a community, it could be the greater Vancouver region integrated with the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish nations. There are absolutely all of those possibilities, but not on a provincial scale or too large a scale. It's very important to have the communities become the watchdogs and stewards. Government is too big for all of our small problems and too small for this big problem of watching and caring for our local environment. We need to do it as communities.
Thank you. The next question comes from Jacqueline. She asks, the Kootenay Arrow Lake forests are subject to a forest plan for the timber supply produced by a large private company. These plans cannot be productively challenged by the very people who live on the land. How can the government empower the general public? And how can we protect our domestic watersheds? And yes, the health of the Kootenay Lake and ultimately the Columbia River.
Well, exactly like that. I don't want to comment on an individual company. It is a process that the government has, and we experienced that in trying to initiate a little pilot of integrated landscape planning with a climate modeling frame. The province was not ready for us. The province was not ready for this process. The province wanted a policy framework. I don't know if they have it now. Rachel Pollard was seconded into the Chief Forester's office to co-develop that with them from her experience clearly. And as they presented 2 weeks ago at the Association of Professional Foresters conference, is the first unveiling of what was being developed. And I was very positively delighted by the concept. I think they are hoping to frame this so it can work, but it has to work locally. It has to work with all of the, I hear a voice from the Arrow Lakes, perhaps, or who's got a place there or lives there. We have a place on Kootenay Lake, and I've had it since '72. And we, as civic members, we have our interests and our ecological concerns, and then the Indigenous people who are recovering, who are finding their culture and recovering their knowledge, their traditional knowledge, and integrating those. That is a process, and it's going to take that kind of complex teamwork. I'm looking to build a team that can do that work from our experience. Others will, and there is a very hopeful future. This is a real possible path. And it's the first time when I've seen all of these systems possibly have an open path that could get supported instead of blocked by government misunderstanding and confusion and traditional bureaucratic responses. So yes, possibly.
Thank you. The next question, we have one from Phil. He says, we're now significantly logging second growth and don't appear to be fertilizing the soil for the next generation. Do you see soil depletion as a problem for our forests? Also, are we planting species like California redwoods that will fare better in a warmer climate, which appears to be inevitable? And we have a similar question from Dave. Is it feasible to plant faster growing species of trees to harvest that would be better suited to our climate?
I didn't linger long on my Western larch image that I shared. Western larch is from southeastern British Columbia, and British Columbia has been doing progeny tests for potential climate adjusted species. It's got trials. We were involved with that program as the industrial partner from California to the Yukon. And the moving the Western larch into the climate adjusted species, moving them into more northerly or higher elevation sites, Western larch has outperformed everything else. And so, yes, there is a future. And yes, the province has a climate conscious program. There is a problem getting species across the border presently. So there's a little bit of a block to some of the initiatives, but the concept of, for example, I'm in total agreement. If you look with Sequoia grandis, with the redwoods, if you look at the makeup of our forests dendrologically by going into the, there's ways to tell what forest we had in the pre-interglacial period, not this current one, but the previous one. All of North America had the dominant species be the redwoods, be the 2 or 3 species of redwood. And instead of here on the coast, it's fir and spruce and the Sitka spruce, it would be redwood, fir, and Sitka spruce as an understory tree and trying to grow taller. And so, yes, there's a lot of room for that kind of creative thinking. And and I apologize. The first question was, because I was going to lead to this first question, repeat that?
Yes. So do you see soil depletion as a long-term
Thank you.
problem?
That's
for
right,
us?
soil. So logging the way we do does hit the soil like a Mack truck. And post logging, you know, I've planted, our organization has planted 1.5 billion trees across Canada, and I've planted about 960,000 of those, covered a lot of the landscape. I know the soils are compromised, soils are challenged. Soils are also incredibly, they rebound amazing. They're incredibly responsive to change. And half of the soil is the whole mycelium community. And so, yes, we've built a climate model, a soil methodology. It's the human terrestrial relationships are among the most complex in the climate game. And thinking about all of the elements of soil, we've done that for the agricultural community. Applying that model to the forests is very challenging. A lot of people are working on it. And I think we can answer some of those questions eventually. We have to. Canada has an incredible soil resource, and we destroyed it in southern Ontario completely in the 20s and 30s, where we had the southern sandbelt and 2 billion tree program to reforest it. But that was all stimulated by pictures of massive white pine, for instance, whose roots were a full 2 meters above the ground, suspended. Tree was cut down, but you could, all of that soil went into Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, and you know, we've destroyed our soil resource before. Are we doing that in British Columbia? In some cases, we definitely are, and probably not as badly as we have been historically, but there's an climate opportunity in modeling and planning to build. It's the biggest carbon sink on the planet, and obviously there's huge opportunity there. And I've been too long in answering too few questions. Please carry on.
Yeah, well, on a similar note, we have a question. Can you talk about the role of forests in any, if any, in the transition to a clean fuel and clean energy solutions? Sorry, in the transition to clean fuel.
Somebody might know my views on this. Have been asking this question. I am, you know, I am not a fan of. We've done a lot of work on looking at biofuels for transitioning out of coal. I know Drax just bought Pinnacle Pellets. Drax has 5 massive coal-fired in England, fired plants all in a cluster. It's the single largest cluster of energy generation from coal, and they completely converted one of their towers to wood. Here we are in Canada, pardon me, having our pellets come off our waste wood in the forest. And yes, it is waste wood. And if it rots, it generates a variety of greenhouse gases, some of which are far more reflective and problematic than you just burn it and it generates carbon dioxide. But England chalks it up on their national registry that they are using renewable pellets, but they're counting on Canada's forests regenerating. We now have forests subject to fire and pine beetle and other pests, and our forests are no longer sinks. So whose account is this ultimately on? In the global, ultimately, it's the atmosphere. What is actually piling up in the atmosphere or not is the key question. And in the global accounting process under the Kyoto Agreement in '97, it was agreed to have biofuels as a clean fuel. It's a transition solution. I'm totally supportive of this as a transition solution. But it's ultimately something we're going to have to ease out of, respecting our industry and transition. I can see why Drax reached over and bought Pinnacle Pellets. This is a problematic accounting. It's an greenhouse gas accounting problem, and I don't personally give it. By 2050, I think we need to have transitioned out of that as well, and be doing something else with the fiber from that wood fiber is just as strong as the wood fiber in a 2x4. I think we'll be putting that all into mass timber, and we'll be facing the accounting problem, global atmospheric accounting problem.
Interesting, thank you. So we have time for 2 more quick questions. So the first one, we've had a few questions on whether pine beetle damaged forest is still harvestable.
There was a lot of speculation when the pine beetle forests, when the pine beetles first started devastating our forests, and one of the companies initiated a way to utilize, because as the wood dries, it causes both your sawmill, your saws, and your planers especially to chatter, and you need different planers, and so you don't get nice clean wood, and the whole business of conversion is challenging, and there was a lot of innovation to figure out how to use it. The question of, well, this might only last 4 years or 2 years or 6 years or 8 years. It's utilizable, and certainly utilizable for pellets. And so I'm not an expert in the sawmilling industry, but I know it impacts pardon me, that was a note I was looking at. It impacts how we think about managing our forests. And yes, there's certainly some value still, surprisingly, in the remaining pine, and it's still being utilized.
Thank you. So the last question comes from Asian. They ask, what are 1 to 3 things, financial, volunteering, etc., a person can do to help support these various initiatives?
Well, there are people working on this, support them. The policy questions are always most critical. The public has moved really rapidly to support the evolution of good policy, and the federal government with their nature-based climate initiative, which is the framework for the 2 billion tree prop. The idea of 2 billion trees is that it's always trees that are additional, trees that are not a part of the obligation. If you log it, you must reforest it, which is where we've been planting most of the time. So the government is looking to everyone for ideas to where could we be adding trees that would not otherwise be there, and in the context of good local biome adapted to climate. And if you're in Vancouver, I find the trees that are doing the best, they're the sequoia. So introducing trees that are going to thrive, that are appropriate, that have been thoughtfully analyzed as an appropriate climate-adjusted species to blend into the new changing environments, and working locally with people to work at any scale, from your own yard to your community to local projects, and supporting them. The climate-based initiative is excellent, and British Columbia has a forest protocol, it had a climate protocol, it has carbon pricing, and get involved with some of these projects. They're going to require financing. This is not all going to come from government, and they will be opportunities that will generate returns. So thank you for a chance to spiel.
Yeah, thank you so much for that very insightful presentation and for taking the time to answer our questions. So I'm going to pass it back off to MP Minister Murray.
Okay.
And then we're going to have, I believe we're having a short video after. So, off to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Dirk, for your presentation. There's always some new ideas for me, and of course some ideas that are familiar. So, thanks for being willing to share with my Vancouver Quadra MP Brunch audience. And what a bunch of great, excellent questions were asked. I recognize that quite a few of them weren't able to be answered just through time issues. There was one question that was aimed at me, which is, have any of the 2 billion trees been planted? And so my answer to that is twofold. One is I am not involved in that program at all because I've recused myself from the very beginning because of my past connections with tree planting. It's not a conflict of interest according to the Conflict of Interest Commissioner, but it could be a perceived conflict of interest. So I'm not involved in thinking about how those 2 billion trees are planted, where or how or when. But what I will say is that from today's presentation, you will be aware, I think, that the 2 billion trees should be thought of as part of ecosystem restoration and creating that additional resilience and health of our forests, and be thinking about the climate and greenhouse gas absorption aspects, as well as what species are being selected and where are they being planted. So what species, where's the seed lot coming from so it will thrive where it is planted, and how does it actually address the issue of climate change and the changing habitat for various species. So if you take all of those things together and you think about this as a nature-based climate solution program, it is pretty complex. You're working with provinces and territories right across the country who have the role of land management and forestry management, have that responsibility. So there's interjurisdictional complexities. And add to that it takes up to 2 years to grow a seedling. So once you've got your planning done and you've figured out where you're planting what and who's doing it and how it fits with the provincial and territorial jurisdictions, you then need to actually grow the seedling. And then you can plant it when the seedling is ready. So as the questioner will probably understand, if we were planting them already today, which is literally 15 months after a campaign promise, we would be doing a poor job and we would be letting down Canadians and our forests by doing so. So I just realized that many people don't have that frame of reference. And once a promise was made 13 or 15 months ago, within a few months, we were being asked, why aren't you planting these trees yet? But I hope today you will understand why that would be crazy and not doable. So Dirk's goal, I know, is to change how you think about forests. And so I hope he's been successful in that. Thank you all for joining us. We will be doing another event next month. But before you sign off, if you have a few more minutes, we have a wrap up that my son, Baba Brinkman, who's a science rap communicator, did after watching a previous talk similar to this. He summarized what he saw and heard in a short rap. And so we're going for your entertainment and enjoyment. We're sharing that with those of you who have time to watch. And I'll be signing off here. So I'll be watching the rap too, but I hope you have an enjoyable rest of the day and month, and we'll see you next month. So this was
all the themes and the names of all the speakers and what they talked about, and it's a very fun and challenging rapid writing exercise to try to cram it all in. So Rob, I think you saw me do this at the Forest Ontario conference, or at the Ontario Biodiversity Conference as well, but back then I was doing it like a spoken word thing out of my notebook, and now I've in the pandemic era I've upped the technological sophistication of it, so now I can do it with beats and DJ myself and all that.
But I think this quote wraps up the Pathways 1 process.
Larry's one of the pre-Rob Keane OGs, just like Dirk Brinkman. When it comes to trying to grow trees, they both go back to the 70s. Conservation done right, but compared to Dirk, Larry was a bit less of a Luddite.
Bear with me while I try to load in my talk.
When it comes to triggering slides, I was like, oh no, Dad. But after the awkward silence of his talk, Dirk wasn't so bad. A tree farm is not a forest or a straight road drone pad. It's a rugged landscape for a bearded man with a hodad.
This is 1973, and that stick is a hodad.
That's right, I said ho, Dad, but not in a typical rapper way. I planted with a hodad too. It gave me some back pain, so check the freestyles I've got. It's science hip hop, and if you didn't know, yes, Dirk is my pop. And 20 years ago when I started rapping, I used to summarize his talk. So let's take it back, y'all. I'll try to summarize his talk. All right. See, every one of us is an immigrant, and by working with indigenous traditions and people, we can all heal the planet's illnesses by following the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and improving the well-being of humans with bioethics. We can tackle planetary carbon levels and solve them, and clear cuts that are visible from Whistler is a big problem, because the international tourists on the lifts are gonna be checking up. So we did a community forest project with the Checkamus, and the climate is changing, so now it's warmer in March, and the solution is planting a lot more California larch in the northern BC areas, which isn't the species home, but it's time to adjust a few climate seed zones. I mean, come on, time is just a relative spatial measurement, and there used to be redwoods here up in the interglacial, so let's just transform and adapt all the ecosystem services and fight back against entrenched industry conservatives. Oh damn, just like my dad predicted in this jam, it was basically the young punk roasting the old man.
I'm looking forward to the inevitable roast of the old man by the young punk.
That's how we do it up in Canada. You can think of it as intergenerational forest fire management, but for real, I know Dirk is about growing our future and growing this movement for 7-generation solutions. And even though I don't work in forests, I work in music, I still appreciate the fact that I was practically raised by Confucius, philosopher, tree planter, bearded hippies and greens who taught their kids to just go off and follow your dreams. So watch out what you tell your kids, y'all. Be cautious. They might end up wrapping your talk up at a conference. See, it's Forest Ontario.
Okay, thanks for that, you guys. And thank you, by the way, to my staff. Thanks, Dinez. You did a great job there as host. And also appreciate the background work of Sabrina, Ying, Catherine, and Tina. It takes a team to pull off a Zoom machine like this. And Dirk, again, thanks very much. May you all have an enjoyable rest of the day and weekend. Bye.